Well, welcome to week 5. This is lecture 3. And we've been talking about missional leadership these last 2 weeks. And this week, we're really kind of honing in and focusing on what does it mean to be a missional change agent within a congregation. And I think that's the role of a pastor. And I know that's not always the way we talk about pastoring. And we're so heavy on the shepherding piece. And I think it's Alan Hurst that helps us understand that within American evangelicalism, we've been really good about honing in and really focusing on the shepherding piece and the teaching piece, but we leave the apostle, prophet, and evangelist untouched. But I think in terms of where the church is and where it's going to require the pastors envision themselves as missional change agents. But the first week the first lecture, we talked about the kind of characteristics, the virtues that are necessary for a leader to be that missional change agent within the context of a community of faith. We talked about integrity, vision, courage, compassion, and humility. And then the second lecture, I talked to you a little bit about a personal story of what missional change agent looks like within the context of a local rural congregation and how that give and take between pastor as leader and congregation and vision and where that plays out might work itself out in the midst. Now, I want to move you to a even more developed conversation in terms of what's called transformational leadership, this idea of bringing change and moving an organization from where it is to where it needs to be. Now, I want to say this first because we're going to talk about a gentleman by the name of John Cotter, who is really sort of a guru when it comes to transformational leadership, and he's got an 8-step process that I want to walk us through when it comes to transformational leadership. But I also want to say this about, as we lean into this conversation about transformational leadership, and that is this. Number one is that you have to be able to display certain levels of competency before people will trust you moving forward. And I think this came out in some of our posts that I read. People won't trust those whom they don't believe are competent, right? And that becomes important. So we have to constantly be in a growth mindset in our leadership and in our capacity to grow and learn new techniques, tactics, methods, and modes of leadership that we are unfamiliar with. And there is never an opportunity as a leader when we stop growing, when we have to when we no longer have to take seriously the kinds of work that comes out from people who do leadership training, where we can read from them and learn from them. So I always love to read someone like Jürgen Moltmann, who is a great theologian, alongside of John Maxwell or John Cotter or the Arbinger Institute, or any number of these different opportunities that we have. Liz Wiseman, who writes this amazing book called Multipliers, Radical Candor. These are great books that have to be read side by side because it's a part of your development. So learning how to develop sense of competencies and disciplines. People need to understand that if you're going to bring change to an organization, you have to both be competent and disciplined. Because if you're not competent and you're not disciplined, people are going to think you're just lazy. And then all of your change that you do ends up being ad hoc, which means in moment after moment. And it lacks the sense of connectedness to this bigger, broader, disciplined, consistent picture that you're bringing before the congregation. And so work on identifying the places where you are not competent. I was just speaking to a young leader not too long ago, and they're interested in someday being a senior pastor sooner than later. And I asked them, how much time have you spent in board meetings? And it was very little. And I said, well, I'm not going to place you as a pastor until you spent time in board meetings. So you need to find pastors who you trust, who you can sit in and see how they do board meetings. Because part of what we do as pastors is we've been commissioned to stand amongst a group of leaders and help coach and guide this movement along God's path. And if I'm not confident in the competency that I have to stand in that room, I'm going to get bulldozed. I'm going to have people call into question my ability. I'm going to be seen as lazy because I'm not following up or following through or setting goals and fulfilling those goals. So you need to develop a sense of competency and discipline. Now, let's look at John Cotter's 8 steps to transformational leadership. And I think these 8 steps are key for us as you begin to think through and answer some of the questions that you're asking right now about how do I get where I'm at to where I want it to be. Now, I understand that not all of us have senior leadership positions, that not all of us can directly and dynamically influence the entire movement of an organization, but we all have spheres of influence. And so how do we leverage those spheres of influence that we have for the sake of transformation, for the sake of this missional, centrifugal mission, this being flung out into the world kind of mission of God that we've been talking about through this course? John Cotter walks through 8 steps, and these 8 steps are really important. The first one is increase a sense of urgency. This is when we bring, so remember that Nehemiah story that we talked about last week, how when the word came to Nehemiah, he was deeply moved by it, and it became an urgent thing for him. This is what needs to happen within the context of the spheres of influence that we share it. We've got to create a sense of urgency. Do people understand what is at stake in us not being engaged, not being involved, not stepping out into the communities that we find ourselves in, not being flung out, being comfortable in where we are? And so how do we create that sense of urgency? We do so through stories, we do through our preaching and teaching. We do so by exposing people to the places of brokenness all around us, where you grab someone and say, come down to the homeless shelter with me. Where you grab someone and say, come down to the rehab center facility with me. Come down to the local community event, where you can see these kind of things happening all around us. Are you even aware of how necessary this is, that God stirs this sense of urgency? So you want to increase this sense of urgency without creating a sense of crisis, okay? People don't